When we think about medieval warfare, most people picture swords, shields, and armored knights charging across muddy battlefields. But the reality was far more experimental, and sometimes outright bizarre. Across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, soldiers, engineers, and even desperate peasants came up with weapons that, on paper, shouldn't have worked at all. Some looked ridiculous. Others were dangerous to the user as much as to the enemy. But somehow, through clever design, battlefield improvisation, or sheer brute force, these unlikely inventions didn't just function, they earned their place in military history. Whether born from necessity, fear, or pure ingenuity, these weapons defied logic and changed the rules of combat in their time. This isn't about the famous swords or legendary longbows. This is about the odd, overlooked, and unconventional weapons that proved everyone wrong. Number 1. The man-catcher. Among the many bizarre yet practical tools that emerged during the later Middle Ages, the man-catcher stands out as one of the most oddly efficient. At first glance, it seems like a poorly thought-out contraption, an elongated pole ending in a semicircular cage-like collar with inward-facing spikes. Visually, it gives off the impression of something more fitting for crowd control at a zoo than a battlefield, but its function was much more refined and deliberate than most would assume. Designed primarily for the non-lethal capture of high-status individuals, such as rebellious nobles, armored knights, or even royal figures gone rogue, the man-catcher solved a very real tactical problem. Killing a nobleman in battle might result in political fallout or a missed opportunity for ransom, which was often a far more lucrative outcome than a body count. What made this weapon successful wasn't its lethality, it was its ability to neutralize a target quickly without causing fatal damage. Knights wearing full-plate armor were nearly impervious to conventional weapons. They could absorb blows from swords and arrows, and were almost impossible to pin down through physical grappling due to their mass and protective layers. The man-catcher allowed guards or soldiers to bypass this issue by targeting gaps and vulnerabilities in armor design, not through penetration, but through entrapment. The collar could clamp onto the upper torso, arm, or neck of a knight, making it extremely difficult to move without getting impaled on the spikes or choking. It gave leverage to the wielder, especially when pulling someone off horseback or forcing them to the ground in confined spaces such as castle halls, narrow stairwells, or inner courtyards. The use of the man-catcher was especially common in Central and Eastern Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, often in urban settings where capturing, not killing, was the objective. Guards stationed at castles or city gates found it particularly useful during riots, or when dealing with uncooperative high-status individuals who couldn't be openly harmed due to social or political constraints. The spikes inside the collar weren't designed to fatally wound, but to discourage resistance. If the knight tried to struggle or pull away, the metal would dig in, not enough to kill, but enough to subdue through controlled pain and pressure. Some variations even had hinged mechanisms to clamp the ring shut, preventing escape entirely until the target was fully restrained. Unlike swords or polearms, which required a killing strike to be effective, the man-catcher fulfilled a different combat philosophy rooted in control, precision, and preservation. It anticipated situations where brute force alone was insufficient or even counterproductive. This aligns with the more complex and often bureaucratic nature of late medieval warfare, where arrests, political hostage-taking, and non-lethal confrontations within noble courts became increasingly common. For example, during courtly disputes or succession crises, guards were often under strict orders to detain rather than execute, making such a tool invaluable. Number 2. The War Scythe. When examining weapons that were never meant for combat but ended up changing the dynamics of medieval warfare, the War Scythe deserves particular attention not simply because of its unconventional origin, but because of how effectively it challenged the assumptions of military hierarchy and battlefield dominance. Originally designed as an agricultural tool for cutting grain, the scythe was a staple of rural European life, handled daily by peasants who had no formal combat training. However, during periods of social upheaval, such as the widespread peasant revolts of the 14th and 15th centuries, and most notably the Hussite Wars in Bohemia, the scythe underwent a transformation. Its curved blade was forged into a new orientation, angled forward, reinforced with iron rivets and stronger mounts, turning it into a fearsome polearm that could not only keep trained infantry at bay, but also dismount armored cavalry with terrifying efficiency. The physics behind the War Scythe's success lay in its leverage and reach. The long wooden shaft allowed fighters to maintain distance from sword-wielding opponents, while the blade's natural curve enabled hooking movements that could strip away shields or catch mounted knights mid-charge. In formation, rows of scythe-armed peasants became a living wall of slicing arcs and sudden jerks, neutralizing the typical speed and shock advantage of cavalry. Historical records from the Hussite period reveal that militias, many composed of farmers and craftsmen with minimal battlefield experience, were able to hold off imperial forces through strategic discipline and clever weapon adaptation. The scythe wasn't just a tool of opportunity, it evolved into a weapon of resistance. Its accessibility meant that thousands could be equipped rapidly without the need for expensive metallurgy or centralized armor production. In siege conditions or set-piece battles, war scythes were particularly devastating in defensive scenarios, where terrain limited the maneuverability of knights and allowed tight infantry formations to anchor the line. While it lacked the piercing power of specialized military polearms like the halberd, the war scythe compensated through its wide sweeping attacks and the psychological impact of a coordinated peasant defense. Facing a wall of sharpened farm blades symbolized not just opposition, but revolution, military and social. Even as more advanced weapons became dominant, the war scythe remained in irregular use across Central and Eastern Europe well into the early modern period, a testament to how function can emerge from necessity and how brutal efficiency can arise from the unlikeliest origins. Number 3. The lantern shield. The lantern shield represents one of the most unusual and specialized weapons of the Renaissance period, an artifact born not from mass battlefield necessity, but from the complex culture of urban self-defense, political intrigue, and night duels in Renaissance Italy. It wasn't designed for soldiers in formation or knights in open combat, but for individuals navigating the unpredictable dangers of city life, assassins, bodyguards, or noblemen walking through the dark alleys of Venice or Florence, where threats often came at night and without warning. At its core, the lantern shield was a small circular buckler, typically forged from steel, but what made it extraordinary was the set of intricate attachments and design features that turned it into a multi-tool of violence and defense. The most defining element was the mounted lantern, sometimes enclosed behind slit-head metal plates to control the direction of light. This wasn't simply for illumination, it served a tactical function by disorienting opponents. In a time before electric light, even a brief flare of controlled brightness in a dark environment could be enough to blind, distract, or trigger hesitation in a duelist. That single moment of disorientation was all a trained fighter needed to close the distance and strike. Some variants incorporated additional mechanisms, like spring-loaded spikes or retractable blades tucked behind the shield's face. These weren't ornamental novelties. They were designed to either wound an opponent attempting a grapple or serve as a surprise offensive move mid-fight. A fighter could feint with the shield's bulk and then activate a concealed dagger or spike in the middle of a motion. The concept was to combine defense, offense, and visual confusion into one compact weapon. There are even surviving examples of lantern shields that include gauntlet attachments or protective hand cages, enabling the user to parry while keeping fingers safe and increasing punching power during a brawl. Despite its unwieldy appearance, it allowed remarkable versatility in enclosed spaces like alleyways, staircases, or balconies, places where full-sized weapons were impractical. It was especially suited to private duels that were technically illegal, where carrying obvious weapons in public could draw unwanted legal or social consequences. Number 4. The Urumi. Among the least conventional weapons ever developed in the medieval world, the Urumi from South Asia challenges nearly every established principle of weapon design, functioning more like a whip than a sword and demanding such an advanced level of training that even among experienced warriors, few could wield it safely. Structurally, the Urumi is a long, narrow half and flexible strip of steel, sometimes multiple strips, measuring up to 6 feet in length and coiled like a belt when not in use. Its construction allows for movement that's unpredictable, multi-directional, and almost impossible to counter with traditional blocks or parries. Unlike rigid blades, the Urumi doesn't follow a linear trajectory. Once set in motion, it becomes an orbiting ribbon of sharpened steel that generates centrifugal force with each pass, allowing it to slash in sweeping arcs that can attack from all sides simultaneously. In theory, it sounds more like a hazard than a weapon, an uncontrollable blade as likely to harm the wielder as the opponent. But in the hands of a properly trained fighter, particularly those who practiced Kalaripayattu, the Urumi became not only viable but terrifyingly efficient. Kalaripayattu, regarded as one of the oldest martial arts still in existence, approached combat as a holistic discipline, emphasizing fluidity, rhythm, and body control. The Urumi fit seamlessly into this framework. Training to use it involved mastering complex circular motions, synchronized footwork, and an acute awareness of spatial dynamics, not just for offense, but for survival. The Urumi's reach exceeded most melee weapons, allowing the wielder to create a protective dome of slicing steel, particularly effective against multiple adversaries. Shields offered little defense because the flexible blade could curve around them, exploiting gaps in armor and slipping into weak points without needing brute force. Its flexible nature also allowed it to bypass rigid defenses, making it especially dangerous against static formations or overly confident swordsmen who underestimated the strange, fluid nature of the weapon. Moreover, the psychological aspect of the Urumi cannot be ignored. Its loud, whipping sound and constant motion disoriented opponents unfamiliar with its erratic pattern. Despite its effectiveness, the Urumi remained a specialized weapon. It was never mass-produced or widely deployed on open battlefields. Its use was mostly limited to duels, ceremonial displays of martial skill, or as a last resort in personal defense. One reason was practical. It required an enormous amount of training time compared to other weapons and was too unpredictable for tight infantry formations. Another reason was cultural. Unlike standardized weapons of war, the urumi held symbolic and sometimes spiritual meaning, associated with warrior identity and mastery rather than raw violence. In some regions, it was even used as a test of martial maturity. Only those with absolute control over their movements and emotions could be trusted to wield such a weapon without endangering themselves or their comrades. There are documented cases where urumi practitioners used the weapon defensively against groups of attackers, creating enough space to retreat or force surrender without direct kills, showcasing its utility in crowd management and deterrence. Number 5. The Firelance. The Firelance stands as one of the earliest known attempts to integrate gunpowder into handheld combat, bridging the gap between melee warfare and early firearms in a way that appears primitive yet proved tactically disruptive. Originating in 10th century China during the Song dynasty, the Firelance was at first a simple bamboo or metal tube attached to a spear shaft. Filled with a mixture of gunpowder and, in more advanced designs, small projectiles such as metal pellets, ceramic shards, or iron filings. Upon ignition, often with a slow-burning match or fuse, it would release a jet of fire and sometimes scatter hot debris across a short distance, usually under 10 feet. Initially, it served as more of a psychological weapon than a lethal one, as the flames startled both foot soldiers and cavalry, disrupting formations and breaking charges. However, over time, particularly by the 13th century, the Firelance evolved beyond theatrical intimidation into a functional hybrid that added an unpredictable explosive element to direct combat. What made the Firelance effective was not its precision or lethality, but its ability to create chaos in moments of confrontation. During siege defenses or surprise engagements, the sudden flare and blast of smoke and fire were capable of triggering disarray in enemy ranks that relied on discipline and cohesion. In a period where most troops were unprepared for the sensory assault of gunpowder explosions, even a brief flash could offer a decisive advantage. The weapon's value wasn't in replacing conventional arms, but in amplifying their initial impact, especially in close quarters where shields and armor offered limited protection against incendiary bursts. There's also evidence that Firelances were used on horseback, providing shock cavalry with a burst of flame during a charge, further compounding their intimidation factor. Despite being unstable, prone to misfires, and requiring proximity to the enemy, Firelances were widely deployed in Chinese armies and later influenced similar developments in Central Asia and eventually Eastern Europe. Their legacy isn't just in their direct use, but in the technological philosophy they introduced, that gunpowder could coexist with traditional arms rather than replace them outright. This fusion approach laid the groundwork for more advanced weapons like hand cannons and early matchlocks. While modern interpretations often downplay the Firelance due to its crudeness, its role in reshaping medieval battlefield dynamics was foundational. It brought sound, fire, and chaos into the rhythm of melee fighting in a way that disoriented even veteran warriors. Its mere presence forced adaptations in armor, shield construction, and formation tactics. Though its range and reliability were limited, the psychological and tactical impact of the Firelance was far greater than its construction suggests. It's a perfect example of a medieval weapon that seemed more like a dangerous novelty than a serious threat, but in practice, it disrupted conventional expectations and introduced an entirely new element into the vocabulary of war. Number 6. The Holy Water Sprinkler. At first glance, the name Holy Water Sprinkler seems almost comical, a misleading title that suggests something ceremonial or ecclesiastical rather than a battlefield instrument of violence. Yet, this weapon, despite its religious nickname, was a brutal, practical answer to the changing nature of medieval warfare, and derived its name from its resemblance to the aspergillum, a tool used by priests to scatter holy water during blessings, but the battlefield version was anything but sacred. Structurally, it was a flanged mace or morning star with multiple metal spikes or ridged protrusions radiating from a central steel head, often mounted on a solid reinforced shaft. Unlike blades, which struggled to penetrate full-plate armor, the Holy Water Sprinkler delivered crushing trauma through concussive force, making it an ideal solution to one of the central problems of late medieval combat: how to deal with increasingly well-armored opponents. By the 14th and 15th centuries, European knights and heavy infantry were clad in increasingly advanced forms of plate and mail armor, which neutralized slashing attacks and even resisted piercing thrusts from swords or arrows. The answer wasn't sharper blades, but heavier, impact-based weapons, and the Holy Water Sprinkler exemplified this shift in martial priorities. With each swing, it could dent helmets, collapse breastplates, and shatter limbs through sheer blunt force. The flanges or spikes didn't need to cut deeply, just enough to break bone, rupture organs, or send shockwaves through the body. What made the weapon particularly effective wasn't its elegance or refinement, but its raw simplicity. It didn't require high levels of training, precise technique, or delicate footwork. It demanded strength, timing, and the ability to swing with full commitment. In the chaos of melee, especially during siege assaults or tight infantry clashes, this reliability became its greatest strength. Interestingly, the weapon also had psychological value. The sight of a spiked iron ball smashing through armor had a demoralizing effect. Unlike the clean cuts of a sword or the distant impact of an arrow, the damage caused by the holy water sprinkler was visceral and visible. Victims often collapsed in grotesque heaps, their bodies contorted from broken ribs or caved-in helmets. This brutality was not incidental. It was part of the weapon's function as a deterrent, reinforcing the fear of close-quarters engagement. Variants of this weapon appeared across multiple regions, from French and German infantry to English men at arms, each adapting the core design to local materials and forging techniques. In some cases, the weapon was even combined with flail mechanics, introducing a chain shaft to increase the unpredictable trajectory of the spiked head, making it even harder to block. Number 7. The gun shield. The gun shield represents one of the most eccentric, yet strangely forward-thinking innovations in the transitional period between medieval and early modern warfare. Emerging during the 16th century, a time when handheld firearms were still unreliable, slow to reload, and prone to misfire, this hybrid weapon attempted to merge defense and offense in a single compact unit. At its core, it was a steel shield with a small firearm, typically a matchlock or wheel lock pistol, mounted through the center or integrated near the grip. From a modern perspective, the concept appears impractical. A heavy, awkward device requiring careful aim and precise timing, with reloading mechanisms that were already cumbersome under normal conditions. But its purpose wasn't to replace conventional arms. It was a product of siege warfare, where confined corridors, stairwells, and gatehouses limited mobility and line of sight. In such settings, the gun shield offered a brutal form of ambush potential. The wielder could guard a choke point and deliver a close-range shot without ever lowering their defense. While the weapon never became widely adopted, likely due to its cost, complexity, and weight, it was not merely a failed experiment. Surviving examples housed in collections like the Royal Armoury show varying designs, some with multiple barrels, some with additional spikes or bladed edges. These variations suggest a genuine interest in multi-role weapons that could be customized for specific defensive tasks. The gun shield's greatest value lay not in prolonged combat, but in situations where one precise and protected shot could decide an encounter, defending narrow entrances, protecting a commander, or stalling an advancing group. It also foreshadowed the centuries-long desire to create integrated weapon systems, something echoed in later innovations like bayonets, rifle grenades, and vehicle-mounted turrets. Though never mass-produced, the gun shield wasn't a complete dead end, but rather a signpost in the evolving philosophy of warfare, where combining forms of offense and protection was a logical, if clunky, next step. Number 8. The Jua or Tiger Claw. The Jua, often referred to as the Tiger Claw, stands as one of the more visually unsettling and mechanically unconventional weapons developed during medieval China's long and complex military history. Unlike bladed weapons that relied on slicing or thrusting, the Jua was purely a tool of mechanical domination, engineered to drag, rip, and disable rather than kill outright. Constructed as a heavy iron claw mounted on the end of a solid wooden or metal pole, it featured sharp, curved prongs reminiscent of an animal's talons, each capable of catching onto armor, cloth, or flesh. Its primary battlefield use was in anti-cavalry tactics, where infantry faced the recurring challenge of mounted enemies charging through their lines. The Jua gave foot soldiers a tactical answer. By hooking into the limbs, harnesses, or armor of a rider, they could unseat them violently, leaving the disoriented horsemen vulnerable to finishing blows from other ground units. In skirmishes against infantry, the weapon could be used to snag shields or pull opponents off balance, disrupting formations and making coordinated defense far more difficult. Despite its crude design, the Jua introduced a dimension of grappling-based warfare into standard melee combat, something rarely addressed in traditional weapon design. It did not require precise aim like a spear, nor did it depend on the sharpness or speed of a sword. It required strength, timing, and intent. Its use was likely limited due to these demands, as wielding it effectively meant exposing oneself to retaliation if the first engagement failed. Yet in fortified environments or urban conflict where ambushes and narrow passageways were common, it became a terrifying and effective tool. The sight of the weapon alone, an iron claw gleaming with violent intent, amplified its psychological impact, reducing even armored opponents to prey in the eyes of their attackers. The Jua blurred the line between utility and brutality, revealing how weapon design in medieval warfare often pushed beyond conventional logic in favor of psychological and mechanical dominance. Number 9. Trebuchets and biological warfare. Though the trebuchet is often remembered as a symbol of medieval siege warfare, a marvel of counterweight engineering capable of launching projectiles over massive distances, it also became the foundation for one of the earliest forms of biological warfare, transforming from a simple engine of destruction into a weapon of disease and psychological torment. As medieval warfare evolved, the prolonged nature of sieges pushed attackers to innovate beyond brute force, especially when fortress walls and supply reserves could withstand direct assaults for weeks or even months. In such scenarios, commanders began to exploit the trebuchet's payload flexibility by launching not only rocks, flaming pots, and incendiary barrels, but also decomposing animal carcasses, refuse, and, in more extreme cases, plague-infected human corpses. The primary goal wasn't physical destruction, but internal collapse, spreading fear, sickness, and chaos within castle walls, effectively turning the defender's own shelter into a festering trap. One of the most documented and disturbing uses of this tactic occurred during the Siege of Kaffa in 1346, where Mongol forces hurled plague-ridden bodies into the city, possibly contributing to the eventual spread of the Black Death across Europe. While the exact epidemiological connection remains debated, the method itself was strategically sound. Introducing pathogens to confined populations with poor sanitation dramatically increased the likelihood of an outbreak. This form of psychological and biological warfare weaponized nature itself, targeting the morale and physical condition of besieged populations. Defenders were faced not just with hunger or military defeat, but with the daily reality of rotting flesh, putrid air, and the constant risk of infection. Walls became irrelevant when the real battle was internal. The trebuchet, already a tool of terror for the way it shattered fortifications, thus evolved into a delivery system for despair, blending medieval engineering with a chilling understanding of human vulnerability. This weaponized decay, though crude, worked with horrifying effectiveness. Number 10, the Zweihander. The Zweihander, or two-hander, stands as one of the most iconic yet misunderstood weapons of late medieval and early Renaissance warfare. Measuring often over 6 feet in length, this massive sword appears at first to be more of a ceremonial object or parade piece than something meant for real combat. However, its battlefield purpose was not only practical but crucial in the tactical evolution of infantry combat, particularly within the ranks of the German Landsknechte, elite mercenary pikemen who disrupted enemy formations in some of the most brutal European wars of the 16th century. In contrast to common misconceptions, the Zweihander was not simply a larger sword meant for showy duels. It served a specific and dangerous role on the field. Its primary function was to breach tightly packed pike formations, which were the dominant battlefield tactic of the time. A trained Zweihander fighter could use the sword's enormous reach and sheer mass to knock aside spear tips, break enemy cohesion, and carve a narrow opening through which allied troops could follow. This type of combat required not only strength but exceptional timing, agility, and control. Wielding such a weapon effectively demanded years of training, and those capable of doing so earned double pay and special privileges within mercenary companies. The grip often extended far down the blade, allowing for half-sorting techniques, where the weapon was partially held by the blade itself, to improve precision and leverage in close encounters. In skilled hands, the sword's versatility allowed it to be used not only as a slashing weapon, but also for thrusting, parrying, and even disarming opponents. Despite its size, the Zweihander was surprisingly balanced, designed with a weighted pommel and ricasso to help manage its momentum. On open terrain, its psychological presence alone could force enemies to retreat or hesitate, as few soldiers wanted to face down a charging man swinging what looked like a sharpened steel door. The sword's effectiveness dropped considerably in confined areas, and it was never intended for castle sieges or mounted combat. Instead, it thrived in wide battlefield engagements where shock and disruption were more valuable than precision or speed. The Zweihander symbolized the brutal transition from medieval to early modern warfare. When armor began to wane, firearms were still unreliable, and infantry tactics relied increasingly on disciplined movement rather than chivalric ideals. That such a massive weapon found functional relevance in this transitional phase of military history defies surface-level expectations. It shouldn't have worked by the logic of weight size or conventional swordplay, but in the chaos of battlefield strategy, where timing and reach could dictate the outcome of a charge, it performed exactly as needed. It was not a relic of fantasy. It was a calculated, high-risk instrument of war,